Now for today's program. Today's Zoominar is part of the Wide River Project, an initiative that takes a deep dive and fresh look into the art, history, and issues that both unite and divide the Black and Jewish communities. We are pleased to welcome Dr. Andre E. Brooks Key, an associate professor of African and African American Studies at Claflin University in Orangeburg, South Carolina. His research focuses on African American religious traditions in the 20th century. Dr. Brooks Key currently teaches courses in the areas of Black social and political thought, African American religion, and African American history. Eric K. Ward is a nationally recognized expert on the relationship between authoritarian movements, hate violence, and preserving inclusive democracy. He is the recipient of the 2021 Civil Courage Prize, the first American in the award's 21-year history. Throughout his career, Eric has worked with community groups, government and business leaders, human rights advocates, and philanthropy. He currently serves as Executive Vice President of Race Forward, Senior Advisor to Western States Center, a member of the President's Leadership Council for the Search for Common Good, Chair of the Proteus Fund, and Advisor to the Bridge Entertainment Labs. Nadine Epstein is an award-winning journalist and author. She has been the editor-in-chief and CEO of Moment Magazine since 2004 and is the founder and executive director of the Center for Creative Change. Nadine's most recent book is RBG's Brave and Brilliant Women, 33 Jewish Women to Inspire Everyone, which she wrote in collaboration with the late Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Please welcome Dr. Andre E. Brooks Key, Eric K. Ward, and Nadine Epstein.
Welcome today. We have a great program today. We're going to be diving into a very diffuse movement generally referred to as the Black Hebrew Israelites or Hebrew Israelites. We'll hear more about that. And it has a long, complex history. It's really important to know before we start that most Hebrew Israelites are not anti-Semitic or extremists, but there is a rising extremist sector in the movement. The Southern Poverty Law Center currently has listed 144 Hebrew Israelite groups as separatist hate groups. So we are here to listen and learn about today, going beyond the news stories. And we've all heard some of these news stories. For example, in 2019, there were two major stories. One was a shooting where 6 people were killed in Jersey City. 5 of those people at at a kosher supermarket, and the 2 suspects who were also killed have been linked to the Hebrew Israelite movement. Then also in 2019, there was another big news story where 5 people were stabbed at a Hanukkah party in Monty, New York, by someone who was also been linked to the movement. So probably everyone remembers last fall, that a basketball player, Kyrie Irving, by the way, I had never actually heard of before, tweeted a link to the film Hebrews to Negroes, Wake Up Black America, that was basically talking about how Jews were heavily involved in the Atlantic slave trade, denied the Holocaust, and said that Black people were the real Jews. These were, that was a firestorm in response. And then a lot of other people probably noticed that shortly after that, hundreds of Hebrew Israelites marched outside Barclays Center, where the Brooklyn Nets play, and shouted, "We are the real Jews," in a pro-Kyrie Irving demonstration. So there's a lot of fears about this movement. But as I said in the beginning, it's a very diverse and very complex group, and most Hebrew Israelites are neither explicitly anti-white nor anti-Semitic, and they do not advocate violence. Today, we have Dr. Brooks Key, we're going to sit back and listen and learn from him so that we can really understand this movement, which is such a fascinating movement, and I think has also had a impact on the mainstream Jewish community in positive ways. So over to you, Dr. Key. For starters, I just want to talk about how most Americans, when they've heard about the community, which I'm not too sure how many really have heard about it, but they hear it referred to as Black Hebrew Israelites. But I noticed in your writings that you prefer using Hebrew Israelites. Can you share why you prefer that term?
Well, first, thank you for the invite and thank you for having me. I think this is an important discussion. So I guess let's get right to it. I do have some slides, but I'll address that question, right at the forefront. First, very few times do any of these African American religious groups use the word Black in their official names. Like people refer to members of the Nation of Islam as Black Muslims, but that's not a term they use. Likewise, Hebrew Israelites don't often put the word Black in front because some see it as redundant because they think all Hebrew Israelites are Black. And secondly, not all Hebrew Israelites are Black. Some members of these communities are actually Latino or Latinx, if you prefer that term. Can't say I grew up, but in my early days as a Hebrew Israelite, there was a white woman who was an Israelite, reared her child into tradition because the child was biracial. So she wanted to make sure that they understood, their religious tradition. So the idea that the Hebrew Israelite tradition is exclusively Black is kind of, somewhat part of the problem. Actually, it's quite diverse in terms of ethnic and racial composition, in particular in some particular communities. So that's the main reason why we don't really add the word Black to Hebrew Israelite.
Okay, that's great to know. Well, what are the roots of the movement? And I know it's a really complicated movement and it goes back a long way, but when did it start? And, who are some of its founders?
Okay. Well, if permit me to kind of get into my slides, that might help answer some of this. If we could step back a second, because I think this will help. This is the webinar description that many people saw, and I have to admit, when I first saw it and people I shared it with, they read the first two lines and they all had the same reaction. And since this is a safe audience, like what the, because they read those first two sentences, like what are they trying to say? So to help kind of understand the problems with framing this particular discussion, and because I'm an educator at heart, so this isn't a gotcha moment, I think this helps with having more honest and open dialogue. So let's look at a rewrite that's meant for educational purposes. So let's rewrite as such. Former American financier Bernie Madoff provokes outrage when he was caught in a Ponzi scheme defrauding individuals and organizations out of billions of dollars. Yet not all Jews are investment bank fraudsters. I purposely use language that kind of plays on ideas that circulate about Jewish bankers. I use the word financier purposefully because in the same way when a person read the introduction to the webinar, it played on certain words, particularly radical, extremist, anti-Semite, and whether we're conscious or not, many times when we have these cross-cultural conversations, we don't understand how they're perceived by, the people we're talking about or people we're talking to. So the question is, are Hebrew Israelites inherently radical or anti-Semites? Let's have that conversation. So about me, why am I able to talk about this? Well, this is a very overall timeline. I wouldn't call it evolution because I don't see it as me going from some primitive state to more advanced state. It's just my religious journey for the past, actually my entire life. And I've been in, and I will unpack some of these words as we go along, but I've been in many different Black and Jewish spaces. And you can see by the different times and phrases that in some cases I was multiple things at one time. And that's not just me. Oftentimes, many people who identify as Hebrew Israelites might be multiple things as well. And again, I'll unpack some of these terms. Likewise, oftentimes when I do these presentations, people think I don't know anything about Judaism. So these are some of the movements that I have either worshiped in, practiced in, tried to join, worshiped with. I didn't get bingo because I've never been to a humanistic Jewish congregation before. So that's the only one I think I haven't hit yet. And these are who I see as Jewish people. Everybody on this list I've met a member of, I've sat at their Shabbat table, worshiped with, talked to, read about, engaged with. So again, I often get questions about, or get the most common comment is, well, there's more than just Ashkenazi Jews. I'm like, well, yes, I'm aware. I've met a whole bunch of them. Yes, everyone on this list I've met, talked to, had some type of encounter with. So let's get to this name again of Hebrew Israelite and kind of demystify it. Like African Americans in general who've been through multiple name changes, African American just being the latest since the 1990s. Before that, Black, Afro-American, Negro, colored, Afro-Jews have also had to contend with the idea of how to just self-define themselves and how to define themselves so they can appear as Jews in a racialized society. So this brief list over here is just some of the ways that Afro-Jews have both had to define themselves and have been defined. So Negro Jews in the early 20th century, yet they defined themselves as Moorish Jews. Then Ethiopian Hebrews, Hebrew Israelites, Black Jews, and more recently, I guess, to include other ethnicities, Jews of color has become quite prominent in today's speech. So for the most basic reasons, Hebrew Israelite has become a term that certain Afro-Jews use to designate themselves as Jewish, but also as Black, and not necessarily being imitative of Jewish identity, white Jewish identity and culture. So it's really no shadowy background to it. In some cases, it was a way to designate that there were different children of Abraham, so to speak. So Hebrew Israelites versus Hebrew Ishmaelites. So it's nothing really more than that, and what it simply means. Next, hope I'm not moving too fast here.
No, it's great.
And what are the types? Because people often say, well, there are different types of Israelites. So what are these types? And part of my doctoral work, I took that question on, and these are the 4 types of Hebrew Israelite. I'm using like sociology theory of the day sects. So if you look at the typology and the axis at the top, and I've since changed this term Western Historical Judaism, people write dissertations, make words too complicated. So it's just rabbinic Judaism, You either have groups that accept the rabbinic Judaism, or they reject it. So if you've ever been to New York and you've met some of the ones that once were in Harlem or in Brooklyn or those places, and they go to synagogues and they, eat kosher food, those are your rabbinic groups. But somewhere in the 1960s, as a part of the Black Power movement, there were certain groups who was like, well, we believe we're Israelites, but it seems like we do more white Jewish stuff or European Jewish stuff than what's written in the Bible. So they began to reject certain aspects of rabbinic Judaism, and they began to deem themselves as Torah only, meaning that they followed the Torah and not rabbinic tradition. Now they read the entire Hebrew Bible, but they only regard as authoritative, things that have come out the Bible, not necessarily the adjoining rabbinic tradition. Then if you look at the other axis, you see the attitude towards Christianity and the Black church in particular. So you have groups that in some shape, form, or fashion might still continue to use the New Testament, might have some type of belief in Jesus, whether that's as a human Messiah or as a divine being or even Trinitarian. And then we have holiness sects. And these individuals, it's less about their beliefs as more that they somewhat maintain certain cultural traditions that came out of the early 20th century and the late 19th century with the holiness movement in the United States. And actually one of the oldest organized ones is known as the Church of God, Saints of Christ. Now their name make you think they're a group of Christians, but they are very adamant that they are not Christians, they are Jew. And they use the term Jews, and that they just simply see Jesus as an example, not someone to be worshiped. And also, what I don't have on this chart is the groups have somewhat hybrids. People have, because these are not static categories, groups often travel back and forth, and individuals travel back and forth. So this typology is just a way to kind of give a general overview of the different types. And actually, the rabbinic groups are typically the smallest, because most African Americans are coming out of the church and feel far more comfortable in one of the messianic groups and if they, depending on their life experiences, they might eventually move over to one of the other ones. But I don't want it to be seen as some type of evolution. It's just lived experience, particularly with the internet. Depends on whose YouTube clip you clicked on, where you end up getting started. And these are the basic foundations of all Hebrew Israelite groups, regardless of how they look, dress, talk, speak. These are the main things that they all have in common. The first is that they believe that the biblical Israelites were a people of color, or to use the language of today in a racialized society, they believe they are Black. Now, how Black? That's up for anybody's debate, but they just believe they were a people of color. Some groups believe African Americans, Afro-Caribbeans, Bantu-speaking continental Africans, and some groups include indigenous peoples in Asia and America. If you actually watched that 3.5 hour documentary, it included a lot of people in South Asia, the Pacific Islands, and indigenous peoples of the Americas. So certain groups believe that all these people are the descendants of the biblical Israelites. Point 4, that both Black people in the Western Hemisphere and mentioned above, and these indigenous people, as a result of a divine curse, lost their true sense of identity and religion. And that the way to return, that by returning to this identity and worship of God, God of the Bible, and upholding, the laws of the Bible, that this will break the curse and bring together the children of Israel back together, and all be happy and whatever. Right. So again, regardless of what box you fall into, those are the basic beliefs. Now, and this kind of gets into some of the questions about extremists or radical. And I kind of break it down into acceptance, ethno-religious acceptance, and ethno-religious rejection, meaning how do these different groups regard, in particular, white Jews? And I understand the term white and Jewish is a very complicated term because of the history of European Jews in Europe of not being seen as white enough or not white at all. But in the United States, the way, Ashkenazi and Sephardic and all different types of Jews, that there has been a racialization process in which at least for Israelites, they're white. Ashkenazi Jews and others are seen as white. So Israelite communities are typically within the rabbinic or holiness orientation. They tend to see both, in some terms, an ethnic and definitely a spiritual connection between them. So they don't see necessarily themselves as something separate. They just want to maintain both cultural and spiritual autonomy over their religious tradition. They don't want to be seen as having to take orders from you know, quote unquote white Jews. So oftentimes in their observance, they're probably more closely related to Orthodox Jews, but the groups that are more likely to reach out to them are the more liberal and progressive movements like the Reform and Conservative. So that often creates some very weird dynamics because you know, whether it's Reform or Conservative will have certain rules that are far more relaxed than the Israelite congregation. And but because they recognize each other on terms of race, it, you know, often creates some very, you know, unique circumstances. So, and again, a person could be an Israelite and actually they're gone away to school or gone on a trip or gone on a vacation, might actually just walk into a synagogue and go for service like anyone else. If they're accepted to a rabbinical school or to a day school and can send their child, they will go there and attend, you know, whatever functions, you know, like, you know, it's February is the high time of Black and Jewish get-togethers. So, you know, things of that nature. Now, on the other side is rejection, ethno-religious rejection. And this also has a reason. And it's in particular to Messianic, but not all cases, because you have some distinct communities who don't. But usually the Torah only, and you have limited individuals, usually individuals, not groups of rabbinic Israelites who tend to reject European Jews or Euro-American Jews or white Jews, if you want to keep it simple. And the rationale for this is, well, for, you know, once again, because American history and European history, Jews saying that being Jewish is a religion, that we're as much European or American as anyone else, we just have a different religion. So these groups say, okay, well, if Judaism is just a religion, then how are you claiming descent to the, you know, people of Israel? So it's like, you said it, we'll take your word because we're claiming something different. And this tends to lead to some of the misunderstandings and the use of a lot of the anti-white or the, you know, anti-Semitic rhetoric, because of one, these are typically groups whose roots start in the 1960s after the organizations they were once a part of faced continuous rejection by the larger American Jewish community. So both the, you know, the group that most people associate, either the Israelite Church of Universal Practical Knowledge or the current group that Kyrie Irving is seen as, you know, attached to, both those groups started in the 60s. And they once came out of a rabbinic group who no longer, they, for reasons, they chose to break away, but still the cultural memory of being rejected is still there, and it often leads to adopting these very negative views about whites in general, and then white Jews in particular. So not excusing it, just saying these are the historical reasons that you tend to see this use of rhetoric and language. So what do we do about this? So how do we confront anti-Semitism? How do we confront anti-Black racism and go beyond these very basic, simple answers, such as, let's all talk about how Blacks and Jews are similar and have shared experiences. And again, this is really only talking about in relation to Hebrew Israelites, not necessarily to the African-American community in general. So I argue that the first thing we should admit is that these people are having different experiences. That Ashkenazi Jews being able to have experience as Jews as whites when they, you know, that's what they're doing, but Blacks, Hebrew Israelites as Blacks are often opposing and differing racialized experiences in the United States. That all of us are responding in some way to white supremacy, and many times we're often going in opposite directions. And then we come together on King holiday and show the picture of King and Rabbi Heschel, you know, and try to make it all go away, or say we all love the Torah, you know, things like that. But that doesn't really get to the roots. And excuse me, what I argue is some of the roots we need to get to is the very first point. And this, I consider this like the agreed upon fiction of both American Jewish and Hebrew Israelite history. It's confronting the legacy of American Jews, Judaism, and slavery. Not saying Jews controlled the slave trade, not saying Jews had more slaves than anybody else. It's simply saying, yes, there were slaves on Jewish plantations, and that these people just didn't puff into thin air at the commencement of the Emancipation Proclamation in the 13th Amendment, that these people went somewhere, and that they didn't necessarily go out and start, a synagogue, that as being a minority within a minority, they end up becoming assimilated into the larger African-American religious world. And that eventually these became leading into some of the congregations that we see today. And it's for Hebrew Israelites admitting that some of what they're doing isn't something from West Africa or something from long, long ago. It's because someone's great-grandmother, someone's great-great-grandfather was on a plantation. And at the end of slavery, they went to Harlem, they went to Baltimore, they went to Boston, and they got involved in an Israelite congregation because they had stories about their grandmother lighting candles on Friday night, but she couldn't quite remember why. Or they just knew in their family they don't eat catfish and pork. That has to do with the process of slavery, not something, 3,000 years ago in the land of Canaan. All right. Next, confronting the supersessionist theologies that we do see in Hebrew Israelite theologies of chosenness, and the theologies of redemptive suffering. Because one of the major issues, and I often write about this, and this idea of Black chosenness is, and particularly if you watch the documentary, it starts out with asking these questions of why Black suffering? And the argument becomes, well, if we're suffering and you're not suffering, then how are you really the people of Israel? And this also lends credence to why these groups tend to advance these Jewish conspiracy theories, because they're trying to rationalize, well, how are you the people if you are not in this state of despair? So confronting that, taking it on, saying how, this really isn't helpful, theologically, because I argue it leads to political quietness or not being engaged with the real world. You're waiting for someone to come save you. And we often see that in some of these groups where they kind of just withdraw from political action. And then last is what I consider rabbinic normativity. The idea that only rabbinic Judaism is real Judaism, that instead of recognizing it's a historically constituted Judaism that arose at a certain time period, and that Jews in different parts of the world didn't necessarily go through this process, and it's okay. And I mean, yes, rabbinic Jews can determine who are rabbinic Jews and then within their movements. But historically, people can emerge through different historical processes. And it means widening the tent, means having very hard conversations. It means admitting that some things, about religion are in fact mythic. And that's a very uncomfortable conversation, but having the conversation nonetheless. So that's my quick little spiel on the issues as they stand. So we can, mix it up and ask, follow-ups and get into it. So, thank you.
Eric, would you like to ask a question?
I have so many questions, but the first question I have to ask Nadine. So first, I just want to say thank you, Dr. Brooks-Key. There are tons of questions that are flowing in, and I can tell folks are leaning in, right, with curiosity, and I think also understanding, right. You're also exploring these questions, right? You're having us kind of lean in. And here's one question I want to start off with. What's the one question you wish folks would ask you, right? As you've been watching kind of the conversations around Kyrie Irving, right? Even before that, right? When we had Ye West, as most folks know, as Kanye West, right? Who was dabbling in some of the extremist anti-Semitic rhetoric, right? A lot of attention came to the fact that he was also influenced by some sects within Black Hebrew Israelites, right? And it's important to keep reiterating in the United States, right, where we hold lots of unconscious anti-Black bias, right, that we're really talking about some sects of Hebrew Israelites. But what do you wish, right? Here you have right now about 250 people participating here live. And what's the one question you wish we were always asking? The first question.
Um, well, less of a question to me, but a question that I guess I would ask is, do you believe Black people are human? And what I mean by that is not whether we're members of the species Homo sapien. I mean, do you believe Black people have the ability to be complex subjects in the world, possibilities, have full ranges of emotions? And what I mean by that is this: let's imagine last day of Kwanzaa, January 1st, that all across the United States, Black folks got together in their homes and had a festive dinner celebrating the death of every single slaveholder and Confederate. What do you think the news would say? They was all these Black folks, they are hate mongering, they anti-white, blah, 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 blah. But every spring, there's a festival. There's a religious festival where people sit around and celebrate God intervening in history and killing the firstborn of Egypt. We call it Passover. And no one bats an eye. So my answer would be that, African Americans create these religious myths, these religious tales like all other humans. And when they're dealing with issues of justice, they gotta be some villains. And unfortunately, there's no Canaanites running around, there's no Hittites running around, but they've experienced anti-Black racism. It just happens to be at the hands of white supremacy. So the villains in many of our religious myths of these particular types of religions, they happen to be white. And not recognizing that simple plain fact, that doesn't mean hating white people, engaging in violence, but understanding that Black people are not these simple children. Like, we really can hold these complex views and not act upon them. And the reason I often have a problem with the extremist language or the radical language is that almost all these groups, whether it's the Nation of Islam, whether it's the IUIC, they all believe in the same way of dealing with white supremacy. And it's a $20 word, eschatological reckoning, which means God will fix it. Like, we won't do anything. God is going to intervene in history. Matter of fact, it's the only reason Muhammad Ali never spent a day in prison, because one of the clerks read Messages of Black Men and realized Muhammad Ali ain't about to fight anybody, because it says, unless Allah himself leads, no one's going to do anything. And it's in the same way. Yes, groups yell and scream on the street corner. Yes, they jump up and down and run about. But they actually believe that the solution will be, at least in their idea, is that God himself will change the situation. So now, just because I said that doesn't mean it's not. I believe all religions can be criticized and can be critiqued. So, I critique these ideas, but at the same time, realizing, accepting, believing that Black people have a right to interpret the world based on Black experience. It's not always going to be pretty. It's not always going to be king. It's not always going to be the language of flowers, healing, and reconciliation. Sometimes it's like sitting at the Seder table. Yeah, I'm glad them jokers are gone. Drop of grape juice or wine. And we know none of us mean ill intent towards modern living Egyptians by doing this ritual yearly. So that would be my answer. Sorry if it was a little long.
No, that wasn't long at all. It's phenomenal, right? I think we don't get enough space to actually kind of hear this kind of diversity of engagement. So I'm appreciative. Help me think through something, or again, even how I might reframe it, right? Or to approach it in a different way. Or the last thing I'll say, understand it is a different story. So in the late 1800s, right, we have the rise of different forms, anti-Semitism we're most familiar with, right? Comes into play in the late 1800s. It places Jews as a racialized other in Europe, right? As non-white, as attempting to infiltrate society, the protocols of the learned elders of Zion. What we're less familiar with are other forms of what folks may call anti-Judaism, right, or at least hostile, right, to European Judaism or to rabbinical Judaism. One of those, as I understand, is the rise of something called British Israelism, right, that begins, largely takes root philosophically in England. And it's based off this idea, as I understand it, super secessionism, right? The idea that Jews aren't the real Jews as we understand it, right? That in British Israelism, right, it framed that in fact Europeans were the true tribes of Israel, right, made up, and each tribe represented a different nation: Denmark, Germany, England, etc. It comes to the United States, and within white society in the United States, right, that British Israelism influences Mormonism, right, Seventh-day Adventist, a faith that most folks don't know much about, but called Christian identity, right, that taught more harshly Jews were the children of Satan, right, literally people of color were subhuman, right, and that white Northern Europeans were the lost tribes of Israel. As I understand it, in the Black community, British Israelism influences the rise of Hebrew Israelites, Moors, Nation of Islam, in some ways, right, coupling with Black nationalism, Rastafarianism. How is that true? Does that fit the timeline? Right? What's missing by just sticking to that kind of literal understanding of influence? How much does that British Israelism in England influence what we're seeing playing out today with Hebrew Israelites?
My short
And that's
answer,
probably a whole class, right?
no, not really.
Oh, perfect.
My short answer would be minimal. Sylvester Johnson, who is the expert on Black ethno-religious identity in the late 19th, early 20th century, has never argued that the reason Black Jews, Black Muslims, Rastafari is because they're reading a explicitly white supremacist religious ideology and saying, well, let's just put some color on it. Again, some of the issues that arise in, particularly early 20th century is Black people are trying to appear. What I mean by that is that they're saying, we are this group of people. But people say, well, those people act like that. So what do rabbis in Harlem begin doing? They begin speaking Yiddish. I don't know if the Christian identity people want to learn Yiddish. What do? They go to kosher markets. I don't think the Christian identity people were going shopping at kosher markets to practice their life. So, and I'm aware that certain African-American Orthodox Jews push this narrative because it helps delegitimize Hebrew Israelites. But it has very minimal, in the same way that scientific racism, you can find certain Jewish ethicists who are taking part of that. Will we say all Jewish thought is rooted in Jewish eugenics? No, that'd be absurd. yes, these ideas float around, as we can see in that video. They're using Henry Ford, but it's less of that is the cause or that is the root than these are resources that are out there for someone to try to prove a point. So no, the Israelite community is not simply British Israelism in blackface. And again, people such as Judith Weisenfeld, Sylvester Johnson have written extensively about how African Americans are adopting these identities by emphasizing ethnicity, because Negro isn't an ethnicity. So by saying I'm a Moorish Jew, I'm an Ethiopian Hebrew, I'm a Moor, they're saying I have a history that is tied to a former land, not that that they're somehow just simply taking part in the Christian identity movement or British Israelism.
Great. Well, I want to ask a couple questions, and then we actually have so many good questions that are in the Q&A, and I wanted to move to them. But I just want to go back to the rabbinical movement a bit, because I mean, I know many people who are in the rabbinical parts of the Hebrew Israelite movement. And, I interviewed Capers Fune, for example, who I know who is the rabbi of a important Hebrew Israelite synagogue in Chicago. And also there are other congregations in Philadelphia that I know of. And these congregations at one time were really kind of separate from the Jewish community, the mainstream Jewish community, but they have now really increased their ties. It's been a mutual, there's been a change, it feels to me like. I just wanted to get your sense, some of these actually, some rabbis, some people have actually gone through rabbinical conversions. But there's a blurring between, I think, some of the rabbinical groups within the movement and mainstream Judaism. Is that your take on it as well?
Well, it's not that it's something new. I mean, again, the first chief rabbi of the rabbinic, oriented communities, Wentworth Addie Matthews, he applied to the board of rabbis. I mean, I don't know if you can get any more wanting to be mainstream than that. He was rejected.
I totally get that. They weren't accepted, but now there's much more acceptance, isn't there?
Yeah, there's far more relative acceptance. And again, I think I alluded to earlier, it's who is reaching out to the Israelite community. So for a very long time, the Reform community has wanted certain aspects of the Israelite community join the Reform community, join the conservative community. And the question always becomes, and this is not just an issue for the Israelite community. We see this at the founding of the AME Church. Like, who gets to dictate the authority, laws, morals, mores of the religious community? And it's always been an issue of wanting to maintain some sense of religious autonomy. And because some more of these movements are like opening up to the possibilities that things don't have to be so homogenized, if that's a good way to put it. So yes, many of these, particularly the rabbinic congregations, have long had relationships with with American rabbinic Judaism. I mean, it's just the opening on the other side, less than them not wanting to have a relationship. I mean, even myself, when I pulled up that slide with my little timeline, when you see conservative, that's when I went through a conservative conversion with a conservative baked in. So, and again, I wasn't the only one. I mean, particularly, Rabbi Fanay has done that for decades now. Mm-hmm. Now, whether or not that would be like a wholesale approach of all rabbinic communities is another question. And we can go back to New Jersey, the Abel Respis. He had his entire congregation undergo Orthodox conversion. So, and that's been the main sticking point, the issue of conversion. If conversion means I have to say, I'm not who I believe I am.
Mhm.
And that's mainly what was the impediment to that type of relationship, because if conversion meant that we were, not we, me, but if, Israelite congregations weren't real and conversion would make them authentic, then they rejected it. So, yeah, I mean, I guess if you're a rabbinic Black Jew, then yes, that would be, a very good thing.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I think people get confused also, because there's the term Jews of color, and there were many kinds of, I've read articles by
Mhm.
people who are Jews of color who are very uncomfortable with being identified or being connected with the
Mhm.
Hebrew Israelite movement, because they came to Judaism or they are Jews in some other way. And
Yeah,
is that
yeah. Mhm.
something that you've experienced?
Yeah, that's a very important distinction. The best way to and I really don't, I mean, I understand the term movement because we say conservative movement, reform movement, but there's really not a Hebrew Israelite movement. There's not this organized, it's not as organized as people think. Uh, so, so when you think about these religious traditions, these communities, they're indigenous African American religious traditions. They have grown out of the African American religious experience. So when a person says they're, a Jew of color, they're saying that their Judaism, their Jewish identity is not tied to one of those communities, which is totally fair. Like, no one should have to carry the weight for somebody else if they're not even a part of it. But at the same time, because of anti-Black racism, Jews of color face racist treatment. So to them, Hebrew Israelites make their lives harder because they're like, now maybe if you're not in your home congregation where everybody's knows, but let's say you're on the road traveling and you go into a synagogue, you're Black. Oh, are you one of them Hebrew Israelites? And you got to lay out your Jewish identity card. Like, no. And that's totally understandable. And then another sad aspect is some Jews of color actually come from Hebrew Israelite families. And, there's a little
Yes.
discord there over the generations. And, that's very unfortunate, but that's kind of why my final point was dealing with rabbinic normativity. I have no problem with Judaism. It's just all Jews, that's not their religious orientation.
Well, it's important to make that distinction about movements. All movements are not organized. As a political scientist, there are many movements that are not organized. And I would have to say that there are also lots and lots of Jews who are of all colors who live outside the traditional denominations today.
Yeah.
I want to ask one other question, because you wrote an article about this and I thought it was so fascinating. And you talk about Black chosenness and how, what is Black chosenness and how did this idea get started? It's something that, again, I just want to start out by saying I can tell from the questions even here that, of course, there are many, many Jews who are very uncomfortable with the whole concept of the chosen people to begin with. Many modern Jews are very uncomfortable with that. And so, but what is Black chosenness?
Well, the way I define Black chosenness is a very unique feature of Black Abrahamic traditions in the African American community. So Islam, Judaism, Christianity, because as African Americans were, undergoing Christianization in this country, their understanding of their relationship to their former religions was being, I guess, destroyed, for lack of a better word, at this time. And they were beginning to see the world through the language, the lens, the worldview of like the biblical language. So they go from being Igbos, Akan, Fulani, Yoruba to Hamites. And then obviously your Muslims and Jews will argue that they're Semites or Shemites. So Black chosenness is a way of dealing with one, a monotheistic tradition, in which, when you look at the three Abrahamic traditions, like there's the in group and the out group. So Black chosenness is trying to argue that we're an in group, not the out group. And really, this is like the launching point for where my doctoral research ended up taking off. I came across a text by African-American philosophical theologian William R. Jones, who wrote a very important text in Black theology called "Is God a White Racist?" ? Where he asked a question to Black liberation theologians like James Cone and others. Well, how do you know God's on your side? And the answer is y'all need to prove it. Y'all need to offer some type of liberation event. And because the problem that comes is that African Americans often argue that because of our poor treatment, and this is where liberation theology operates from, that God is on the side of the oppressed. Well, if they're oppressed and they're saying God is on their side, then that's their argument for chosenness, that because of their degraded state, that they're the chosen, which leads right back to, your question about, like rejecting white Jews or Ashkenazi Jews, because that, like, attaching to all those conspiracy theories, because they're saying, well, how can you be the chosen if you are in this position in society? Now, obviously, every Jew of European or Euro-American descent isn't living high on the hog. Well, I guess say the lamb if we want to keep it kosher. But they're making that argument based on, we're at this state, you're at that state. How does the theology work? And it works also against successful African Americans. So amongst all the ramblings of Kanye West was, well, I had to offer my mama as a blood sacrifice, because the argument is that well-doing African Americans have made a deal with the devil in order to be to sustain success. So those two pieces work together by being rooted in this idea of chosenness, because you're in this state of degradation. I hope that wasn't too long. I feel like that was.
No, and that connects. I think you talk about somewhere how that connects to the trope of, white Jewish world dominance.
Yes.
Which sometimes we see coming out in some of the rappers' music and some of the statements by, sports people on sports teams. This theme keeps coming up, and this is part of why it's coming up, you're saying. Okay.
Well, yes, and just to add, because going back to, we have to have honest conversations.
Yes.
Let's go back to the 1990s when Ice Cube left the group NWA. Well, he made a charge against his former manager, Jerry Heller, who was Jewish, and said, he didn't say all Jewish people, he just simply said, this particular white Jew is ripping me off. Jerry Heller goes to the ADL and says, he's an anti-Semite, he called me Jewish, and said I was taking his money. ADL steps in on the side of Jerry Heller, calls Ice Cube anti-Semite, and all it does is reinforce the narrative that Jews have power. So sometimes overreacting creates the very conditions you don't want to be believed in. So, and I took one for the team. I watched that entire 3.5 hour documentary. In my opinion, the from Hebrews to Negroes, right? In my opinion, it made a non-situation both bad and worse by putting the more and more Kyrie has to do this and so it gave the appearance that there was this inordinate amount of Jewish power that could be wielded, and it gave the appearance that somehow you can't do stuff, or else, quote unquote, the Jews will get you. So I'm all for holding people accountable. I'm all for critique. I'm all for calling things out. But sometimes you can create the conditions that you're actually trying to fight.
Eric?
So I know, Nadine, we have to go to some of these questions. We are a lot are coming up, but I just have to pop in. a little bit because it's interesting to think about. You may not know Dr. Brooksky, but Nadine and I have had many conversations. Those who are watching right now have participated in some of them, where we've talked about kind of the idea, right, that both anti-Black racism and anti-Semitism can exist within the same time and space. Meaning, right, I can both be a perpetrator of anti-Semitism, right, and still be on the receiving end of anti-Blackness, or vice versa. And one of the ways we kind of talked about that, right, at the time, I can't remember, right, which incident we were talking about, but we were noting basically the difference, right? Tucker Carlson gets held to account in a not in a way, right, that in a Kyrie Irving or a Kanye West will, right? Meaning, right, the response to anti-Semitism, right, the level of energy seems to also break down on the skin color of the perpetrator. And we're just acknowledging that. Not that anti-Semitism shouldn't be called out, right, but that there is a disparity in terms of who's held accountable and how. And we're just acknowledging, right, that we live in a society that has anti-Blackness at its root, right, and teases out at that in different ways. By contrast, right, anti-Semitism is not as well understood, even though I would say anti-Blackness is not well understood in America, but anti-Semitism is not as well understood. We understand in some ways, right, the impact of the Holocaust, right, but as I would often say, right, understanding anti-Black racism simply through the lens of the terror waves of lynchings that happened in the 1920s through the 1940s isn't an adequate frame. It's not enough to kind of understand the dynamics and the systems. I wonder, I'm thinking about systems of anti-Semitism, and I'm thinking about, right, anti-Semitic tropes that come into play. I mean, granted, it is true, Ice Cube was speaking about one individual, but in a society that places Jews in that wider trope, right? In the same way, this is a society through anti-Blackness that frames most of us as criminals, right? People may be conscious about that frame or unconscious about that frame, but it's how we are framed, and it's largely how society approaches Black people and treats Black people. Is there danger in not confronting those tropes, right? So how do we know, for instance, when it's important to confront that moment and when it's important to understand that confrontation may not actually get us to the outcome that we're seeking?
All right. Well, let's go back to the Ice Cube situation. I mean, I hope people, I don't know who's in the audience, but
yeah, we don't even know. You might, yeah, you explained it, but yeah, some folks might be young enough. I just realized some folks may be young enough, they may not even know.
Yeah, he just might be the barbershop guy, or I'll be there yet. So I think the way Ice Cube was framing the lyrics, because this is all about a song, is that you had a group that was, everybody, well, I guess everyone knows what NWA stands for, the literal letters. And he's pointing out the paradox that a group that's calling itself NWA is being told by a white guy what to do. Like, again, it kind of goes back to that, your first question to me is like, about the question. I'm like, recognize that Black people can speak in very sophisticated ways. So in that case, I just think that ADL should have said, hey man, that's between you and your client. But again, now with the Kyrie Irving situation, because it was, we have social media, so everything's so public. I think just letting the social media, letting the Twitterverse drag him, puts far more pressure on a person to change their ways or rethink things. Because I don't really participate on Twitter, but I mean, people's lives can get ruined by people getting dealt with. I think the social pressure from Twitter users, like, man, what are you doing? What are you posting? Could have policed him in a different way that held him accountable, and it didn't look like there was this asymmetry of power. Because again, like I watched that, like that was a painful watch. And I sincerely don't even believe he watched all 3.5 hours, because once he had to go back and like reassess, and he was like, oh, well, I guess there are some things that's very questionable. But no, I think you're right that there has to be measured response. Otherwise, people will do anything and say anything, get away with anything. But in, really assessing that, does this make something better? Or does it add fuel onto the fire and, disperse the problem, whereas the problem could have been far more isolated to this particular incident? I think the Deshaun Jackson issue is a better example, because it was very isolated. People had to talk with him, moved on. But here we are in February, still talking about Kyrie Irving.
Yeah.
I think we should get to some of the incredible number of really interesting.
So many questions
So
that
Eric,
we're definitely going to have. Yeah, we're going to definitely try to encourage Dr. Brooks Keys to come back with us, Nadine, because there are so many questions. I'm going to just pick one, and I'm going to go from early up, Nadine, and then maybe you can grab one of the more recent ones.
Yeah.
Right. So there are a couple of questions here that folks are kind of curious about. It's more historic, and it may, again, as you said, be more mythological, but there are folks who are curious. We know the majority of slave owners were not Jewish, neither disproportionately, not by numbers, right? That also is an anti-Semitic trope. But we also know there were Jews who were slave owners, and interesting enough, right? Those folks are most likely would be known as Jews of color today in the way we understand the color line in the United States. But folks are curious. Can any of the Hebrew Israelite practices, beliefs, origins be traced to Jewish slave owners? And a person said specifically, right, would it make sense that the religion, right, of the slaves on the plantation might be Jewish influence rather than Christian influence?
Well, if I'm understanding your question, you're asking whether if someone was a slave on a Jewish plantation, would their practices be Jewish?
Yeah, might they have become Jewish?
That's what happened. Often the way though is, when we're dealing with this issue, it's almost imagine like slaves on Jewish plantations would be the only slaves in human history that did not acculturate to the culture of their slave owners. The Greeks, the Romans, black folks on Christian plantations, even if they didn't formally become Christians, they understood the flow of Christian culture. So now here's the thing. It's not necessarily that that these people who are enslaved somehow left a plantation with perfect rabbinic Judaism intact, because that would be so absurdly unexpected, unless there's some proximity to the actual family, such as cooks and things of that nature. But the issue becomes, and talking about this, is that when they left, there's really nowhere for them to go, because you see in the historical record a black person pops up here and there, like in a you see a newspaper account. There was a mulatto Negro in the congregation. There was a Negro Jew in the congregation. So the majority, like I said, had to assimilate into the larger African-American Christian culture. And that's where those Jewish traditions most likely reemerge. And that's not saying that these congregations that start are all packed with people on Jewish plantations. It's just simply saying that these are where these individuals would have reemerged when they start saying, you know, we're going to organize a congregation. So, and if you notice, many of them will use as a name, you know, House of God. So it's very generic in a way that, you know, saying, you know, church, but saying House of God, you know, kind of becomes this way of straddling the line between, because there's examples that, like in Chicago, there's a group of Black Jews who are sued for calling themselves Jews. They got to go to court. Because they were seen as impersonating whites. So there's a very complex history in that, you know, post-emancipation, early 20th century, where these categories, and this is at the same time that you have Eastern European Jewish immigration. So again, how are they going to appear as Jews? It becomes a very tenuous situation for these early 20th century congregations that are emerging. So this is why the adopting of rabbinic traditions becomes so important, because to them that marks what a Jew is. So speaking Yiddish, wear a certain type of dress, you know, behaving a certain way, eating certain food. That's what makes one a Jew.
Well, let me just pop in here. I'll throw out a few questions here too from the audience. How can you compare how Hebrew Israelites have been received by the quote unquote mainstream American Jewish community with how the Nation of Islam and other groups like that have been received by more mainstream Muslim organizations? I thought it was a really interesting question. And the Nation of Islam is somewhat connected through the kind of chosenness connection as well. Tell us a little bit about that.
That's a great question. I meant to touch on that. Well, actually, in the piece that I co-authored with Rabbis Isaac and Manasseh, we raised this issue that whereas the Nation of Islam mainly suffers from an issue of both orthodoxy, you know, proper beliefs, and orthopraxy, proper practice, like do y'all pray the proper way, or do you have the right beliefs about the Prophet Muhammad? Hebrew Israelites also have an additional problem, and we've kind of deemed that what we call ortho-ethnicity, being seen as the right people. So, you might believe lock, stock, and barrel, and all the main tenets of rabbinic Judaism. You might practice, the halakha perfectly, but in some ways you might still be seen as not Jewish enough because you're not seen as having the right Jewish ancestry, or not having Jewish ancestry at all. And this also leads to the problem why particularly rabbinic groups are so to the socially conservative, because they're trying to appeal to a more orthodox understanding, because they believe that will bridge this gap of them being seen as legitimate. And but it actually has the reverse response, because the more they approximate, or the closer they get, the more they get rejected, until more recently now. Because it's like we have to keep clear boundaries. So if it's a question of you're not the right people, not whether you not have the right practice or you have the right beliefs, but if you're not the right people, then it doesn't matter how observant you are.
Yes.
We're not, and I mean, I can attest to that in my own actual life of being in a synagogue. I won't say where or when, but being in a synagogue, and I would purposely try not to be number 10 in the minyan, because on one occasion, we had visitors. They started the prayers. And again, I guess if we got people who don't know what I'm talking about, I'm sorry. We start doing the morning prayers. One of the regulars comes in, starts counting, and looks over my direction, and he goes, it ain't 10. And he whispers to the visitor, we don't count him. And they went outside. This is a totally true story. They went outside, got the neighborhood drunk, put a kippah on his head. It was like, minion. And they started all over again. So it had nothing to do with how observant I was. It had nothing to do, how sincere I was. It was like, you're not the right person in sense of peoplehood. So that's what I mean by, like, yes, the Nation of Islam might be seen as heterodox in beliefs and practices, but once members of the nation, like in the 1970s, after Honorable Elijah Muhammad died, and they made a shift over to Sunni Islam, it was like, well, y'all fine. As long as y'all believe right, pray right, ain't no problems. But Hebrew Israelites have always had that additional hurdle of being seen as also the right people.
Yeah. Well, I have two more quick questions for you. One, as somebody asked, what was the main factor that drew you to the to becoming a Hebrew Israelite and then to becoming more involved in Judaism?
It kind of relates to the last answer I just gave. If those slides I pulled up. So I was born into a Christian household, but the first time I constantly chose, to kind of control my own identity was in high school. So I kind of became, like a religious nationalist. I was still Christian. So it really, to me, it became like being like Jesus. Well, eventually it ran into the point of, I ran into, a group who was like, they're Israelites, but they still believe in Jesus. So I was like, well, Jesus was Israelite, then I need to be an Israelite. And, that kind of ran its course, because once I was like, well, I don't need to believe in Jesus. Jews don't believe in Jesus. Then I got set on another path of, like, I need to get more Jewish. So I went from just being a rabbinic Black Jew to need to be a conservative Black Jew. So when I have Orthodox on that one slide in quotes, not that I ever converted to Orthodox Judaism, but I had moved to a Jewish neighborhood, Orthodox Jewish neighborhood, and was trying to, carry out that level of observance. But that's something that affects many rabbinic Black Jews, not necessarily Jews of color, but rabbinic Black Jews, is becoming more observant to feel like you're more authentic. And I guess what the gas ran out, and I was like, I don't need to do this. I can be a good person. And again, I don't necessarily consider myself an ex-Israelite or an ex-Jew, because I don't see my particular religious life as a evolution. It's just more, that was a part of my life just as much as once upon being a Christian. So my Jewish part of my life leads to where I'm sitting right today. So I guess, in that sense, like this trying to reach a certain level to, once again, to be seen as authentic or legitimate, and, coming to that contradiction that was not the right reason to practice a religion, made me step back from it in a way that, I maintain respect for it, but at the same time realizing that I didn't need that to be, seen as worthy as a human being. If that makes sense.
Absolutely. I think it makes sense to probably everybody here.
Yeah.
So I have one more question, I think, and then I know we're running way over. And then maybe Eric, you want to pick one last question, but there are these extremist parts of the movement, and I say movement with the understanding that it's a very disparate movement. But is there any chance that these groups would come into dialogue with parts of the Jewish community, or are these, could that happen, or will that happen, or should that happen, or is it?
I don't know if anyone's ever asked them. Now, obviously, trying to ask them on a street corner ain't gonna turn out too well, because that's a performance, and that should be remembered. That is a performance. The average member, just think about it. The average member is probably not independently wealthy. They have a job, so that it's not like they're not around other white people on a daily basis. So whether the leadership of these groups would be willing to engage in dialogue, I guess it depends on what they have to gain from it. Because if, as I said earlier, if they see themselves as a totally different people, then it's like, what do we gain by recognizing you and you recognizing me if there's no there's no benefit? Now, it probably was, I think it would help them a whole lot to at least have conversations so they could be taken off some of these lists. Because at the end of the day, the average member of one of those types of groups is going about their day, not bothering anybody. But it's the public performance of anger that constantly gets them in trouble, because again, it's the performance is what they see as them doing their job to bring people back. Because in many ways, by doing that publicly, they're showing just random Black people walking by, we're willing to stand up to white people. In the same way that you asked about Farrakhan, the last question. I'll make this quick. And it also relates to Eric's question about handling anti-Semitism. Farrakhan was not I'm gonna use a sports analogy. He was not the first string quarterback. He wasn't the second string quarterback. If we think about Jesse Jackson, John Lewis, and all those people, he wasn't even the third string quarterback. He was a walk-on. And how did he become so important? When he got labeled the Black Hitler, and he ran with it. He said, see, I'm willing to stand up to these people. And then he ends up on Donahue, and he's all over the place, and he gets a stature of being seen as someone willing to speak the truth no matter what. Mm-hmm. So sometimes not giving the person the platform they're actually seeking keeps them from being a problem. So in this case, if they're willing to speak and away from cameras and all that, that'd be totally great. But in some cases, just leave them guys on a street corner, because if this is what's going to make them less important. Removing the conditions that they are using to argue for, which is, saying that they have the answers to why Black people are suffering. Because during the early 2000s, they were at their lowest point because they had built up the year 2000 is when everything's going down. Well, 2000 came and went. So they began to lessen in any type of influence and importance. They only become relevant again, particularly with social media, but after Trayvon Martin, after Eric Garner, after all these things are happening, Trump was elected, and they say, see, we told you so. Obama wasn't going to get you anything. And so they are not, regardless of how many streaming shows you see on Amazon or books on Amazon, they are not that significant. So giving them more attention gives them more attention. I mean, no one acted like this when Kendrick Lamar put one of them on their record, but the reaction to Kyrie gave them something to rally around. So leave them on the street, let them scream and holler, but improve society around them, and their message has less impact. And
Great.
That's my comment.
Great point. Eric, you want to, anything else?
I'm going to go really quick. I know we only have a few minutes left, and Dr. Brooks Keys, I just want to first of all thank you for being with us. Thank you for allowing us to lean in with curiosity, right? One of the things we really wanted to do with these programs was to lean in, to be uncomfortable, to hear a story told from a different perspective, right? That we don't often get to hear. And you really have done that today. And I want to thank you for that. It's really two questions. So I'm gonna ask first of them. One is a question from someone, and I didn't hear you say this, but they put this in the question. So I just wanted to give you a chance to respond. right? And they said, surely you don't believe that Jews themselves will say you can only be Jewish if you speak Yiddish or eat a certain way, right? And they were curious about why we didn't respond to that. I actually didn't hear you say that, but I wanted to give you a chance to respond to that. But then I had another question that was also in the chat. Folks wanted to know if they wanted to learn something deeper, if they wanted to read more, right, about the ideas and the concepts you're putting forth, a book or two that you might recommend. And so I was hoping you might do that as well.
Well, we're going to send a whole list. Remember, we will
Oh.
send a follow-up list of some of his articles and some suggestions to everybody who's attended today too, just so you know that, Dr. Brookski.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll address well, first, thank you for having me. This was wonderful. I'm working at a historically Black college. I teach 4 or 5 classes, so being able to do things like this is always wonderful. That I can have people engage with some of my more public scholarship. So the point was, I wasn't saying that Jews were like white Jews were saying you had to speak Yiddish, do this, do that. I'm saying that Israelites, in order to be seen, will do these things to show that they're culturally relevant, that they're being observant. So it's not that any of this is coming from the actual Jewish community towards Israelites. Is that this is a way of appearing. I'll give you a context in a more international sense. There are groups of Igbos who are from, it's an ethnic group in Nigeria, Southeast Nigeria. And for some time, they've been saying, we're Jews. We have a tradition of Judaism. The former abolitionist Alado Equiano talks about the similarities between Igbo practices and things he saw in the Bible. So he's like, there must be a connection between us and the Jewish people. So that's like 1700s. So Igbo Jews in the contemporary time, right? So one time I received an email from, a spokesman who was collecting matzah for Passover. And he's like, can you send the brothers and sisters in Nigeria who are practicing, returning to Torah, can you send them some money for boxes of matzah? And I was about to hit send, like, sure. I said, wait a minute. They don't have flour and water in Nigeria. I said, if they don't go out there and make some matzah. But the reason was they want to be seen as authentic. So they go and they eat matzah, like store-bought, the store-bought matzah like everybody else. Because to them, eating the kosher, pre-boxed matzah makes them appear Jewish to other people. So they do things like, they ask for yarmulkes. So you got, Igbos walking around in Nigeria with somebody's old bar mitzvah yarmulke, because rather than making one, they're wearing the little silk yarmulkes because that's how Jews look. So again, this isn't necessarily something that's being imposed upon them. This is how marginalized people often do things so they can be seen as legitimate to the dominant society. So I hope that clears it up, that I wasn't saying anybody had to eat gefilte fish to really be Jewish.
That's such a great point. And of course, I know plenty of Jews in the United States who walk around with African yarmulkes.
Yeah. I think I have one over in the drawer over here.
For a whole variety of reasons, yes.
Yeah.
This has been remarkable. I'm so grateful that we've had this chance to listen and to learn. And I've learned a lot. And I wish we could answer all these questions, but as Eric said, I think we'll have you back so that we can start going, because we've just really, touched the surface of this very important movement, and from which we can all learn from. We can learn about Judaism through this movement. It's, really important. Thank you.
Thank you again for having me.
Okay. So thank you all of you who stayed on. I know we run over half an hour, which we rarely do, but Thank you for everyone. And we'll be back next week. Suzanne will be sending you a bibliography of articles to read, and also information about our programs next week and the week after.